Welcome, Ian. Thanks so much for joining me today. First of all, congratulations are in order, I guess, for getting Plurilock listed on the Venture Exchange. So congratulations. And we'll talk more about that later in our conversation. But let's start from the beginning. Let's talk about your journey. What got you here?
Well, thank you, and thank you for the congratulations. I think at my core, I'm ultimately somebody specializing in data analytics. I've always been very interested in the power of data and how it can ultimately solve problems. The last 10 years, I've been working in and around the data analytics space. I think 5 or 10 years ago, you heard a lot about big data and what big data can actually do for you. And what I've specialized in doing is actually harnessing the data assets that companies have to be able to solve business problems. Spent about 4.5 years doing primarily e-commerce analytics for a venture-backed firm. That firm was eventually acquired by eBay. I then went on to found a bootstrapped firm called Exapic, and we were ultimately helping companies manage, mine, and monetize large data assets. And then I've been, we helped, myself and the chairman helped spin out the technology of what is now Plurilock from the University of Victoria. And ultimately, we're using data to answer a very specific question in cybersecurity. And that question is, are you the right human on the device?
So you have spent your earlier years in sales and data analytics prior to moving to the world of cybersecurity. How has that proved to be an asset, and what were some obvious challenges along the way?
Well, I think that the thing that most people don't realize is I've actually been doing the same job for the last 10 years. And so genuinely, we, as a company, and as all companies do, we have an inherent asset, which is the data that gets created as a result of the product or service that we offer. And functionally, what I've been able to do is take that data asset, figure out who in the world has a problem that we can solve with that data, either create a solution or just leverage the data as is, and then scale that either in a vertical or a geography to build up a larger business. It's funny, actually, I was on the phone with a colleague who was working on a similar data challenge in the traditional retail space, and was offering some guidance on how to think about taking the existing data that they had, potentially actually augmenting it with other data assets that they have, and then building a new revenue stream from it. And this is just functionally what we're doing. Now, I think with Plurilock, what's really interesting is that the question that we're answering is, are you the right human on the device? The methodology for how we solve that is actually quite straightforward. We use machine learning and artificial intelligence to take a data stream in. Generally, that's looking at the keyboard cadence, the mouse cadence, or the mouse movements, I should say, and being able to make a decision. But this is functionally the same thing 5 years ago or 10 years ago. The only difference really is just that the domain now is in cybersecurity as opposed to e-commerce or retail or even advertising, who all ultimately have the same data challenges.
So are you the right human on the machine? For our audience who don't come from the world of cybersecurity, can you help us walk through what behavioral biometrics is, what continuous authentication or multifactor authentication is? And the second part would be, like, how is your team helping all the clients that you work with currently to find a balance between security, but also usability and productivity?
Yeah, it's a good question. So once upon a time, many years ago, if you had a password on your computer, that was the security, right? That was kind of the pinnacle of security. And then after a period of time, then you would need a password, but also antivirus. You needed to make sure you had antivirus on your computer. I think now where we've ended up is a situation where you need a host of controls or protective applications to be able to defend against today's cyber threats. Now, in the industry, this is called a defense in-depth strategy. And so you just assume that even if you've got the best firewall in existence, it's not going to protect you against all the threats. Similarly, if you have the best antivirus in the world, it's not going to protect you against all threats. So you really need to be able to defend against the gamut of attacks that exist out there which could come from nation states, it could come from criminal enterprises, it could also come from potentially insider threats. Now, in the identity space, which is where we operate, ultimately the protections in place are trying to make sure that it's the right person who has access to the right data at the right time. That's in effect what identity governance and inside the identity and access management ecosystem, that's the question that it's trying to answer. Now, historically, you've done that through a password. So if you know a shared secret, which is generally what a password would be, and if you're prompted for that password, if you enter that password in, it's assumed, okay, it must be Ian who's typed in that password. What we have found, though, is that passwords are quite easy to steal. It's very common that you might have a situation where maybe I use the same password on a system in my personal life, and I've reused that same password on a system in my corporate life. Well, if that password gets compromised, if somebody steals that password from some website, let's say, it's very common for bad guys to attempt to use those passwords that have been exploited somewhere else, test them against corporate systems, and use that to gain access. Well, now that means you need something more, you need additional factors of security in order to govern the identity of the user on the system. Multi-factor authentication is the idea of using multiple forms of authentication to reduce the likelihood that there's an imposter on the system. Generally, there's 3 forms of authentication. You have something that you know, like a password or PIN number, something that you have, and this could be a cell phone, it could be a USB stick, it could be a token of some kind. And then the third form is something that you are. Now, traditionally, these are what's known as biometrics. So if you have a smartphone, you might use your thumbprint to unlock it, or you might actually have the facial recognition capability. These are all leveraging uniquenesses about the individual human. Now, what behavioral biometrics does is, without the need of any specialized hardware, we're able to identify the individual based on their behavior. So for what we do is we actually look at the way you type on a keyboard, the specific speed, rhythm, and cadence of how your fingers interact with that keyboard. We also use the same types of characteristics on the mouse. We look at the direction of movement, the speed of movement, the change in speed, the change in direction. And as a result of using machine learning, we're able to build up a profile of what is normal for you as an individual. And then once that profile is built, we can use that profile as a form of authentication. Now, ultimately, because we're using behavior that, for the most part, users don't need to do anything extra with, we're able to continuously authenticate. And so this means every 3 to 5 seconds, we're able to do an identity check in the background to constantly verify and validate that you are, in fact, the right person. I think with, particularly in today's environment with COVID, it used to be that 90% of workforce employees would be working in an office somewhere. You might have 10% salespeople, et cetera, who are on the road or might be working from home. Now that's switched. Now you have 90% working from home and only 10% in the office. Well, now that you have 90% of your workforce at home, how do you know that it's actually them on the other end of that device? And crucially, how can you gain confidence that it's the right people on those corporate devices without incurring friction? And so what we're trying to do at Plurilock is be able to offer security controls for the security teams to gain confidence without actually incurring any additional burden for those users to jump through more hoops, to type in more passwords, or to fumble with their phone trying to read a 6-digit text message, a 6-digit number in a text message, within 60 seconds.
What are some other key, working from home, of course, the one you mentioned, but what are some other key challenges your team is trying to solve for your clients?
Well, I think Plurilock is very focused on the identity component of cybersecurity. Now, what's interesting is that the cybersecurity industry over the next 5 years is estimated to be spending over $1 trillion. So this is a massive problem. And cybersecurity really touches everybody. I don't think a day goes by without a new data breach that occurs in the news. Certainly, a lot of the IT systems are now being set up in such a way to be security first. It didn't used to be this way, particularly in the 80s and the 90s. security was more of an afterthought. And so security and cybersecurity specifically is becoming very pervasive in everyday walks of life. I think that the opportunity, particularly for a company like Plurilock, is to be able to leverage newer technologies. So how can machine learning and artificial intelligence reduce the friction that an employee needs to go through in order to get through their workday? And there's a lot of opportunity there. And so for Plurilock, we're very focused on identity-centric cybersecurity, which really means if we start from having confidence that the right user is who they say they are on the device, can we reduce friction elsewhere within the workday? So let me give you an example. If the user on the device has already been authenticated, can we allow them to skip some of the prompts or challenges when they go to log into, let's say, a payroll system or a wire transfer system? Think of this almost like going through a toll booth. If you have to go through multiple toll booths per day in your car, it can really slow down traffic. If you have effectively a fast pass that allows you to just speed on through that toll booth without having to slow down, the productivity gains that you get on an individual basis can be quite high. If you then look at the productivity gains across an entire enterprise, they can become really, really big. Not to mention just the emotional relief of not having to be frustrated with your computer systems. So I think to answer your question, Plurilock is really focused on identity-centric cybersecurity, and specifically to be able to balance between offering a secure work environment alongside user convenience.
Let's go back to Plurilock going public. So what's the next big milestone then? Of course, this is one big step for any company that's looking for external public funds, and just next possible step in the expansion phase. But what's the next big milestone for you and for your team?
Well, Plurilock, you're correct. Plurilock did take an unusual step, which was that we pursued a public listing earlier than I would say other companies typically do. You know, most technology companies will generally go down the venture capital road. And effectively what that means is they stay private. There's not usually an opportunity for the average everyday investor to participate in the success of those companies. And then they may pursue a public listing, you know, later on in their company life cycle. I think Plurilock saw an opportunity in the industry because cybersecurity is quite fragmented, and there's I often say that cybersecurity is a team sport. You really need to be able to interact and play well with others in order to deliver a security solution that will defend against today's attacks. And so there's an opportunity for organization. And so for Plurilock, that means if, as a public company, we're able to more easily conduct acquisitions and be able to offer a broader array of products and services to our customers. Now, I think that the benefit to the overall ecosystem is that Plurilock is one of the few early stage technology companies that are public. And so that means that for investors who are interested in joining us on that journey, they have an ability to do so, which wouldn't have been the case if we were private.
What were some of the lessons learned along your journey that can help other entrepreneurs?
I think that the most important thing is building for a specific problem. And in Plurilock's case, we were looking at the identity space from a couple of different angles. We were approaching it both from a different industry perspective. How does a federal government organization look at identity? What matters to them, and how is that different than, let's say, financial institutions or healthcare organizations? And for us, it became very clear that there were a whole number of opportunities where a more frictionless mechanism to authenticate could have been valuable. You know, I think that's actually fairly horizontal. It's a ubiquitous value proposition. I think anybody would say yes to being able to frictionlessly authenticate without incurring more friction. What we found is there's a number of verticals. So the federal government, generally speaking, and we've certainly done some work both in the US as well as in Canada, has a specific pain point around assuring the identity of the user. As well, we have a number of financial services customers, financial institutions, And the magnitude of risk involved is also quite high. Not necessarily a state secret level, similar to the federal government clients, but for asset managers or for banking institutions that have literally billions of dollars of assets under management, you really need a high level of assurance that it's the right person as they're moving funds around or wiring funds, that typically can't be sent back. And so for us, it was being able to prioritize and niche down to a very clear value proposition to a very clear set of customers, and then being laser focused on that and actually saying no to a lot of other opportunities. And so my advice would be to be very, very specific around what is the value you're providing. Obviously, if you're building a data solution, you can think of this in terms of what question am I answering. And so for Plurilock, it is very focused on solving for workforce identity. So making sure that it's the right employee who's on that device for a specific set of customers in the federal government space, financial services, and also in healthcare. And even being as specific in terms of the size of organization. So perhaps, companies that are 500 employees and below may be too small, potentially companies 50,000 employees and above may be too big. I think the more granular you can make your target, actually the easier your journey becomes, because you get more clarity in terms of what you actually need to build to be able to satisfy and deliver value to that customer segment.
A lot of takeaways there for all the aspiring entrepreneurs. Thanks so much, Ian, for your time. Wishing you and your team a lot of success in the coming months and years. And let's stay connected.
Thanks, Nirad. I appreciate it.